Welcome to this episode of the Swishes podcast. We're going to be talking about company life cycle. All of these podcasts are available on swishes.com or on Spotify. So today we have in the panel Michelle Wang, Armin Scharlach, Chris Holmes and Nadia Stoykov. And we're going to talk about life cycle, as I said, and our image of a big corporation is that it employs lots of people, pays a lot of tax, offers a reliable service, and of course, it's big. But against that, big companies lock up resources. They can be bureaucratic and slow, and they tend to look after themselves rather than other people. And from that respect, they can be bad for society in general. Small startups, on the other hand, may be sexy, but they tend to have a high failure rate. They invite suspicion. They get prejudiced, they get discriminated against by corporations as being difficult to deal with. But inevitably, the majority of us have our formative experiences in big companies, so we tend to look on them favourably. We're biased towards them. So do we need to think more to challenge our view of this life cycle of companies and what it means to become big? So I'm going to throw the discussion open and we can all come in, offer your points of view. Armin.
Thank you, Bill. So my wife is often joking that I've been too long in consulting because I always tend to structure things first before I get to conclusions. And I think that it makes sense in this particular topic here as well, because there are two very, very different subsegments why companies die. Some die sooner, others later. And I think when we are discussing about the reasons why they die and whether it's good that they're dying, or even inevitable that they are dying, the answer is a very different one when we talk about those who die sooner than those who need a little bit longer, but they're all going to die. To say it with Charles Bukowski, we're all going to die. What a circus.
I've been in a company that died, Armin, and it was not pretty from the inside or the outside. But it was fun for a while, especially as it was so inefficient. It was quite lucrative to work there for a while. There were lots of interesting things to do, but it was far from good for its customers or society.
So maybe we start with the ones who die sooner, discuss about why they are dying and whether it is good that they are dying. But in order to open the discussion, maybe someone else would like to pick up here.
Okay, let me pick up here because I think that we need to dig a little bit deeper into the topic. Because on one hand, you have a company and every company goes through life cycles, as Bill said. On the other side, we have an industry. And industries as well go through life cycles. There are industries that are dying and others that are just being born. And you have to look at a company, at a particular company, from the point of industry it is in and the life cycle it is in. Why this is interesting? Because there are multiple combinations, and I don't think that there is a formula that says this company will die or the other is not going to die. We all work for companies that lasted more than 150 years and are still kicking. Doesn't matter for how long, but longevity has nothing to do with, it has actually everything to do with industry and everything to do with the people that are playing the game at the stage when the company is in. But let's discuss that because I think the culture of the company is very much setting it up for dying or living longer. Let's put it this way, apart from the other factors.
Chris?
No, I think that's really interesting because example from my own career, I worked at Xerox very early in my career, which is quite a long time ago now. That's a company, it's a case study in its own right. Here's a company that got absolutely had its market completely taken away by the Japanese companies that came in. They didn't anticipate it. They didn't see it coming at all, and yet did manage to reinvent themselves. And I think that one of the questions that I find interesting with this topic is this whole point of kind of inflection points, I guess, ultimately, that says, well, they could have died at that point. They could have gone under. They could have given up. Whatever however you want to look at it. But they reinvented themselves to some degree. Now, interestingly, I was looking them up to see where they stand today, and still going through a lot of transformation by the sounds of it. And they they quote themselves as being their core business is kind of document management and printing. And you kind of immediately, to Nadia's point, you're going, well, that doesn't feel like an industry that I would think is flourishing, if you like, in that sense. Nigh on 30 years since I worked there, probably. And you kind of go, well, that company has had a much longer life cycle than one might have expected from the 70s when the whole original issue happened with the Japanese competition. So I find that piece around the industry and the company and that inflection point as interesting.
That's fascinating. There's a book I don't expect anyone's read. It's called Inventing the Wheel, and it's about inventing somebody who invented the wheel in ancient Egypt in order to carry blocks to make pyramids. The wheels were made of stone, and it takes the development of the wheel through being made of wood for carts to being made of steel with rubber tires. But it's about how the industry changed as it went. If you were still making stone wheels when wooden wheels came in, you died. And the industry I was in that died was fertilizers. But when I was in it, what they were selling was new and sexy and high price. And they had a position in the market that basically dominated it. They had a technology edge. They invested in capital, and they could operate on marginal costs very successfully. But as soon as competition came in, as soon as the thing went generic, they floundered. They just didn't know where to go. They didn't know how to exist on lower margins. And so even though there's still a fertilizer industry in the world today, the company I used to work for certainly does not exist in that form because it failed to make that transition into the more mature phase of the industry, to Nadia's point about the difference between a company and industry.
I think these external influences, Nadia, that you mentioned are definitely one of the reasons, but they are externally imposed. And whether they are a pandemic or an entire industry change, it's quite difficult for any company to survive in the long run without completely changing into something different, going into a different industry, which some companies have accomplished, but that is hard if the world around you is breaking into pieces to survive. What I find interesting is those companies that are in industries that are still there and running well, and still they fail for many reasons. And you mentioned Chris, the example with Xerox. I'm always thinking at the most famous example of Nokia compared then to Apple and Samsung, where they completely have not understood the dramatic change with the smartphone area. While they had the first smartphone that anyone was having, I even had one myself, the Nokia Communicator. And I was so disappointed that it took them 2 or 3 years on average to come up with a new version, while everyone else was coming up with something new and shiny every other year. That was for me the reason to move on and go somewhere else. And I think that's a very common thing that you see, that companies are feeling too well settled in their market. They think they know everything, they know their game, but they're not seeing that the game around them is changing.
I had a Nokia in 2009, Armin. It wasn't one of those fancy ones that you had. I within a week of trying to use it, I decided that Nokia would be bankrupt within a year. They could not sell a product
Bill.
like that.
When I look into this topic, I go to theory to start with. So what's in my mind first is why company exists. So it has to exist to meet a certain requirement or certain demand, whether it's products and goods or services, one of the kind. So what triggers me to think, and I think a lot of them been mentioned by all of you already, is the typical Porter's 5 forces, if you think about it. So where you sit in the whole, do you have any threat of the new entrants? For example, Apple versus Nokia, and what's the potential substitute? Do you still have to press the button, or is it can be a touch screen? And then before you actually look into the company itself, your cost, your structure, etc. And some great examples have been mentioned, but one of also the typical one is good ones would be IBM. If you think how the IBM started, it is pretty much as a computing company. How it has been involved through the innovation dominance in the computer industry, and then gradually with the rise of the personal computers and how they renew and reinvent and shift their focus to software, to services, to cloud computing, to consultancy. So to me, the company life cycle, in my view, every company always at a certain stage of the life cycle. But what I believe is not necessarily have to be dying at the end of the life cycle. A good proportion of them could be a renewal. Then by definition, whether you're saying it's a cease to exist, the old one, and becomes a new one, or it's a continuity. So it's by definition. So that's how I was taking on this topic.
I wanted to ask Michelle very quickly if anybody knows quite how IBM did it, because I've never been able to follow this or read much about it. Where did the initiative come from for IBM to keep changing itself? Was it top down? If so, how did they get that analysis of the industry and be able to change so many things simultaneously and move everything in the right direction at the right time, to coordinate everything, to change from hardware to software to services to whatever? I have no idea how they did that. I'm just throwing that question out there. You don't need to answer it now.
I have a view. IBM, or if you look at GE, they really diversify and they have the finance to back up. They can afford for some part of the business to fail. That's why I think it's maybe one of the reasons. I don't know all the details. I only just read about some case studies as part of the research.
Now we've got two models. We've got the model of IBM, which almost turned on the spot and marched off in a completely different direction. The whole company was going in one direction. They decided to stop and move off in another direction. And that's very different from GE, which was a classic conglomerate, which had all sorts of different business areas. And if one failed, another would pop up. And that's a different sort of change.
I thought IBM still had the hardware business also, right? I don't think they completely switch totally.
I'm not sure whether IBM is really a perfect example for adoption, because I actually see that quite different. I started my career working for Pricewaterhouse, which became PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it became IBM. But it was, I already had left, so I did not have to go through that period. But I obviously have got a lot of friends still there and got quite some insights. But not only from these discussions, but also if you look into the market evaluation, if you look into the revenues that they're doing today, they once were a global behemoth, and they are far away from that these days. I think Apple is making 8 to 10 times more revenue a year than IBM is doing. So while they are not dead yet, they are only a shadow of what they once had been. It's not so much that they failed to adapt. I think they were somewhat adapting, but where they have been probably falling into a very common pitfall of these large organizations is complacency. Like in the Nibelungs saga with Siegfried, I think if a company feels invulnerable, there is always something somewhere where you are vulnerable, and the more untouchable you see yourself, the more the competition is seeking to find this vulnerable spot and taking advantage of it. And I think that's part of the reasons why IBM is no longer that much of a big player that they used to be.
But guys, please look at all of these comments. There is one common thread. All of these companies we talked about, GE, Nokia, and IBM, are all companies in their very mature stage of development. And that is really what they have in common. And that's why they will never be the giants that they used to be before. Why? Of course, they will survive because they're filthy with money, and although they will never make the same revenues again, they will still have a steady stream of revenue. But what killed Nokia? You know the story of Nokia, one of the oldest Finnish companies that had such a stiff culture, if I can say that, and very bureaucratic, that actually it couldn't respond to the dynamic industry. They thrown themselves by coincidence almost. And that's why they couldn't survive. Otherwise, they had a brilliant product. So it means that the mentality of who you are, so if you're 70 years old and you want to start a new company, okay, you're going to think differently than a 20-year-old that wants to start the same company. And the chances of you winning and understanding the world that you live in, the world of, let's say, the younger technology and generation, you're more likely to fail. And this for me is the Nokia example, comparison to the Apples and all of the rest that actually proliferated in the past years. And that's why life cycle is really important. It has to do with the culture, and it has to do with who your managers are, who are the people working there, how creative they are, how innovative they are, and how much of a space they're allowed to innovate.
Well, I was going to say something different, but actually Nadia's just raised something really interesting there. I think one of the questions for me would be kind of, so what? Who cares? Up to a certain extent, it's an element that is, yeah, all companies go through life cycles. Some are much longer than others. It matters to the people that work there. Obviously, it matters potentially to customers, etc. But it's kind of interesting to me in terms of, well, what does it matter up to a certain extent? And I think some of the examples we've talked about that connect also to another book, just to bring in, is Clayton Christian's Innovation. In The Innovator's Dilemma, which speaks very much to this point of companies getting so big, so inflexible, so lacking in agility, and so unable to look at an alternative future that they're blind to the innovations coming in from much smaller companies that actually come and eat their breakfast, if you like, in that sense. And I think that's some of the elements of what drives the life cycle, I think is kind of really interesting to me, and is that cultural element to Nadia's point that says, well, if the culture of the company has become bureaucratic, has become complacent, has become arrogant, whatever term you want to use, then there's a fair chance that's going to drive a shift. But again, I guess I'd ask the question that says, up to a certain extent, so what?
I remembered a good example what can echo Nadia's point. So Netflix and Blockbuster. So it's two people from Blockbuster set up Netflix, and then Blockbuster failed to adapt the digitalization element of it. So it just shows the culture and the company structure does have an impact in the people. It's an innovation, and that helps boosting the business. And then to Chris's point, I'm thinking an example of Coca-Cola when you're saying that to a degree. So this is how I see Coca-Cola. They are not selling a product, and Coca-Cola has been surviving for God knows how long, and is still booming in my view. I'm contributing to their revenue on a daily basis, but they do have some certain, Iron Bull in Scotland, right? Pepsi and Dr. Pepper, all those, but still very strong position that Coca-Cola as a company and a brand. Nadia just showed me a, bottle of Coca-Cola, right? Proof with evidence. I like that. So to me, Coca-Cola is not selling only the product, right? They're selling a kind of like this happiness, and people want to associate with it, with things when they do certain things. When they're going to a football match, they drink certain beer, or I don't know, I'm not a football fan, but Coca-Cola, when I want to chill out and I grab a bottle of Coke, I feel better. So go back to the market demand point that I raised earlier. I think a very core element of how the company can be existent longer, size does matter, and how they adapt to the market does matter, but the unique proposition that a company has compared to all the competitions, go back to the Potter's five forces. If you really have a unique selling point, you could overcome the bigger company may have those bureaucracy and what have you. Personal opinion for reference only.
I like the example with Coca-Cola because it gave a positive twist that I otherwise wanted to make already earlier. The various reasons why companies usually fail is they either have a bad product, and that is definitely not the case. They have a good product. There might be companies that fail because they have a good product, but there's not much demand. Everyone on this planet needs to drink, and therefore I think they have found a super sweet and convenient spot that will not cease to exist anytime soon. Companies die because they have a good product, but they do bad marketing. And I think there you have touched a very important point. They have been brilliant, dominating with marketing excellence, which also meant that they were very good in retaining their customers, which again is otherwise often a reason that companies are failing, that they might have good products and they had convinced people to buy something, but they were not able to keep them on board with, of course, a bit of service quality or things like that. And last but not least, the final reason that comes to my idea why companies are failing is that they have all good products, good marketing, good customer retention, but because of that, they're growing so fast that their organization is not able to keep up with that growth. But there, Coca-Cola had the big advantage that they had been able to establish themselves globally over a long period of time, and therefore have also even navigated around that cliff. They are a pretty good example for a candidate that has a good chance to stay for much longer than any other company in the world, I guess.
Do you think that's because, as Michel said, they don't really have much of a product, but they do have an incredibly strong brand character?
And they maintain it. That's the
They
important
maintain
thing.
it. Yeah. So they invest mainly in brand character. And that brand character evolves as people change, as society changes, as culture changes. And because they've invested and keep up to date with their investment in that brand character, they can sell this, what is a very cheap product, and add value to it. And it can be whatever people want it to be at any given time. And they're not locked into $1 billion investment in a chip-making plant or an oil refinery or anything like that.
That's a pretty good business model.
I would maybe I'll bring a counterpoint then. So as someone born in Scotland, I was thrilled that Michel raised Iron Brew. But as someone who hates Coke with a passion as a product, I would have a different view. And the sooner that company dies, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But because there are issues with that company in terms of what they do and what they're selling. They have a responsibility connected to obesity all over the world that is driven solely by their product, well, not solely, but by their product. So yeah, I have a slightly different view of Coca-Cola in that sense. But
Chris, we switch to Rolex. That's also another example, right? It's a bit of eternity topic. It's a classic. It's not that much influenced by the time moved on because people are looking for something unique and long-lasting. So here we go. That's another example.
Yep. Yeah, and it was interesting. I had a look at kind of oldest companies in the world just to get a sense of what they were. And it's a little difficult to tell because inevitably companies go through M&A and what have you. And the oldest one dated back to 578. So that's not bad going. If
you don't know that, you don't recall what it was.
I do. It's Congo Gummy. It's a Japanese company that basically is a specialist in construction of Buddhist temples. So that's pretty niche, but nevertheless, they did get bought in 2006 by a large company. So they are now no longer. But for 1400 years, they were. And actually, in that list of kind of 10 or so companies, there weren't many that made product. They were one. Beretta, funnily enough, the Italian arms company, is a very old company. I had no idea how old they were, but many of them were service related, actually. And that kind of surprised me as well, because I wouldn't have expected those things necessary to last. Some of them were banks, as a for instance. Kind of surprising, even though that banks had got such a long history, if you like, in that sense.
I'm going to suggest something outrageous. I'm going to suggest that companies die when they get too efficient, and that they get too efficient by focusing on what they do, stripping out often the middle management, the middle layer, the middle office layer that has a corporate memory that links the back office, the front office, what you do with what you're marketing. And when that's gone, you don't have people with the time and the interest and the broader spectrum and the ability to look outside the company and see what the world is doing outside. You have focused too much on the operational efficiency, the input-output relationships. And so when the world changes, you have no ability to change with it. Nobody who can look outside and say, oh, this other company's doing this, maybe in a completely different industrial sector. And say, maybe we should try that approach, because all you have is people with their noses in their computer screens or in the factory or out selling the same product. So I'm saying that a lot of industries are killed by efficiency.
How about McDonald's? They're pretty efficient and they focus on global expansion and they're still ongoing.
Well, I have to say it has to do with culture again, because, I was reading an interesting article, and the article was at which life cycle, what type of a CEO you should hire, because there are different personalities that you need for every cycle in which your company is. You, Bill, are talking of a company that goes only to cost cutting and efficiencies, which is a typical mature company in any industry. But it's very important as well what type of people you hire in this company, because you can change the culture by hiring different people. But in order to do that, you have to have somebody on top whose personality and personal life cycle is what you need at the moment. Do you need a builder? Do you need a visionary? What type of a CEO you need? And very often the boards are really engulfed in themselves and they hire one and the same type of CEOs that fail one after the other. This is something as well. The article was extremely interesting. If I find that, I'm going to. But was extremely interesting of how important it is to match the life cycle and the top executives in the company.
I think you have a very important point here, Nadia, why there is a mechanism in place that is supposed to prevent that from happening, which is called the supervisory board. We see way too often that CEOs move on from their CEO position into the head of the supervisory board, and then you have this continuation there, and then that is not necessarily always to the benefit of the company, as you rightfully pointed out. Build one point on what you were saying with the cutout of the middle management. Here I need to actually definitely position a little bit the idea that you don't necessarily have to have that function bring in these inputs from the outside world with your own personnel. You can very much outsource it. I'm not saying that you always should, but if you have good strategy advisors, consultants, you don't necessarily have to have this as an in-house function. We all know that there are companies that have been wrecked by consultants. There are companies that have been prospering by consultants. There's good and bad and everything. But I'm saying that this cutout of the middle management is not necessarily dooming the company to fail.
I wonder as well how much, going back to Nadia's point, I wonder how much with some of these things we can really only tell in hindsight. And because when you're living it in the moment, it's often very difficult to see where are we in our life cycle, and frankly, I think in most companies to actually admit to ourselves where we are in the life cycle, because nobody wants to go, oh yeah, you know what, we're on the downward curve. And so let's embrace that. Most companies aren't going to do that. And so I do think there's an element of kind of hindsight with this that makes it very difficult to be smarter about it, if you like, and say, well, how could we recognize we're precisely at this point in the curve and change our trajectory? And I think there's probably relatively few companies that have successfully done that. Just to add to Bill's point as well, I think going back to Xerox, actually, one of the interesting things about Xerox, and actually also Philips, if you've ever followed Philips's history, both of those companies were ones who were incredibly innovative and had kind of skunk work type organizations that were working offline, if you like, to bring innovation outside of the corporate kind of line, if you like, and all of the kind of bureaucracy that goes with corporate life. But both of those companies were really poor at translating that innovation into real life. And they got, in both cases, they got overtaken by other people who did it just far faster. They invented it, but other people actually brought it to market and took their share, if you like, in that sense.
I like your point, Chris, because I think it leads into a very interesting thought. What does this mean for every one of us here in this discussion, and everyone who's listening to the podcast? I'm not taking myself there out of the equation. I have been to companies where I should probably have left earlier than I did, because it's, I think, a typical human nature that you feel loyalty, you think the grass is always greener on the other side, so maybe things are still developing to the better. Therefore, you're typically quite patient. On the other hand, every one of us probably already has learned in school that it's the best who leave the ships first, the sinking ships. And my recommendation to everyone is once in a while, every year, every second year, have an honest, open discussion with someone you trust who's not in your company, not in your firm, and simply ask yourself the question, am I in a dying company? Are there other companies where I could be better positioned in a better environment? And if you come to the conclusion, no, everything is fine, then it's even better that you have this affirmation. But if you're getting a feedback from someone who is unbiased, then it might make you think and not be the last one leaving the sinking ship.
I'm going to pick up on Chris's point about companies that were quite good at inventing things, but no good at bringing them to market. And I'm going to say that is also related to this lack of a middle layer, because companies that are relatively fat tend to have a lot of internal politics, a lot of internal competition. They have the opportunity for these little niche areas to grow and to compete with each other. It looks chaotic, it looks wasteful, it looks angry, frankly, when you get areas competing with each other and telling the board different stories. But if and when they make it, they've made it by a competitive process within the company, when they're released to the outside world with products and sales support and all the rest of it, they have got to that point because they've already been challenged in a competitive, albeit an internal environment. And I think a lot of the good ideas that companies have just have no chance of survival because suddenly the company wants to take it over and say, this is the way it's going forward, and tell them what to do and apply corporate systems to it. It doesn't stand a chance because it doesn't get a chance to evolve in a competitive environment. And I'm saying companies are just too lean.
I would say the complete opposite, Bill. Sorry. The complete opposite. I've seen so many large organizations with middle management that is completely paralyzing the organization. And I think the best example is if you're looking a little bit outside of the industry into these organizations where the middle management is the probably biggest, and that is governmental organizations. And I don't think that they are particularly adaptive and agile as you would think they are.
Not only that, but just creating silos because, silos could be competitive if you can afford it, but it's not economical to have, let's say, two teams working on one project and finance both of it, unless you're a startup and you don't pay them anything and they're just enthusiasts. And that's when they succeed. Otherwise, the chances for success are not there. For me, the survival and part of rejuvenation of the old companies is to break down the silos and create smoother communication and working across departments. Because today one of the biggest problems is that you have islands. And each island, depending on who's running the island, is better or worse than the other. But they're all fighting internal battle that they don't need to fight.
I think we underestimate the importance of internal battles. Internal battles create succeeders, people who dominate and succeed and have been challenged in the fire of competition. And back to Nadia's point about industries and companies right at the beginning. One of the analyses of why China is successful today is that when the government decides it wants to get into electric vehicles, for instance, it throws shed loads of money at the industry. It doesn't really care who gets it. They all start competing with each other. And then the government sort of backs off. You get a small number of people that succeed, companies that succeed in that environment, and massive numbers who go to the wall. So currently BYD is the number one success story in EVs. There are about 3 or 4 others who are following on their tail in China, but that came from this competition after the government had thrown an awful lot of money at it. And I'm suggesting that companies are unable to do that for some reason because they have this passion, this fetish for efficiency and leanness. I'm going to stick to my guns on this one.
I would counter that with evolution. So to put it a little bit on a higher perspective, and I think evolution has shown us and taught us that competition is good, but you also know that in evolution, in nature, take a tree, you are having many, many branches developing, but the rather sooner dying of the weaker ones let the stronger ones benefit significantly from it. So while it's good to have a couple of branches in the beginning, it's also good to get rid of the weaker ones rather quickly.
I am a Darwinian.
Okay, yes, natural selection is something that works with markets as well. But in the company life cycle, of course, because that's our topic, let's go back to the basics. You have to be vigilant and always realistic about where you are in the company life cycle as a company. And many of these companies, just like people, want to be young, to continue to be young, to do facelifts. And at stages of development where it makes absolutely no sense, they go and invest in throw money in stupid ventures just to show to their shareholders that there is some hope for growth. But you have to just say at the point in time, just milk the cow. You don't need to grow anymore because you're at a stage of development. What's the point of throwing all of this money? What's the point of behaving like a young company in a growth cycle? You're not in a growth cycle. Enjoy your cash flow. Enjoy your stable margin, although not very high, but stable. Enjoy your revenues and just pay off your debt and be happy. But very few companies could actually be brave enough to admit to that. And whoever did it actually survived longer than the others.
That's a very good point to sort of begin to wrap up. Anyone want to come in on Nadia's point about be happy? What's wrong with being a cash cow?
I think the market is dynamic. So if you stay static and maintain that, eventually you need to be able to adapt it. And by adapt it is by not keep doing the same thing. In my view, it's not adapted. So from a risk point of view, every company should have a little preserve and to start innovating to look at what the other element. And fundamentally, you need to diversify. You need to make sure that when you look at the company life cycle, it's not my company, just one product, one service in this stage. I believe every company, even you break down at what level, is always diversified. So for Rolls-Royce as an example, we start with car manufacturing. Now they mainly focus on the service element of the engine. So they sold the car, they bring in new things. Similar example as IBM, they need to grow and moving on. So it also depends on how long. I think someone mentioned here that the duration of a life cycle, and that's based on industry. If you look at tech companies, that bell curve is much narrower than a traditional manufacturing. So everything in relative. I fundamentally don't think that we should just stay fat and happy and just continue what we're doing. I'm sure you don't mean that, but you could certainly enjoy your competitive advantage as long as you could, as far as you could. But outside that, there need to be an element that you continue to look out for what the market is changing and be adaptable.
Armin wants to come in, and I'm going to go to Armin to start winding up now.
I very much enjoyed this discussion as always, in particular as you and I have quite different views on this middle management thing, but that's inspirational and that's thought-provoking in its best sense. Summary, I would recommend, if you haven't done already, to take a look into the work of Josef Schumpeter, the economist, who is actually a good example for being agile. He was born Austrian. He became German in 1925, I believe, and became American in 1939 for obvious reasons. So also in his personal life, he has shown a lot of adaptability and agility. And he has been spending a lot of time in his career thinking about what are the bigger implications on the economy, not just for the individual firm, but the economy, and came to the conclusion that it's like in nature, like a forest fire, like the competing branches on a tree, that it is a good thing that companies die, some sooner, some later.
I like that. That also brings to mind the Swiss approach to how they manage their national parks. But yeah, look, I think interesting discussion, and not least because, as ever, if we all agreed and all had the same view, then it would be a pretty boring discussion. I think this has kind of raised quite a few different topics that I think could branch out into some future podcasts as well, frankly. So yeah, no, really enjoyed the discussion and really enjoyed getting the different points of view from everyone.
Good discussion. Thank you very much. Of course, we could have gone for hours because there are many things to share. And when you have a good thought-provoking conversation, then things are popping out. But I still insist that people shouldn't be, and companies shouldn't be very greedy. Although, to continue the point from Michelle earlier, you always need to look for your environment and see how you fit in. You don't have to be necessarily big to be happy and successful. You don't need to constantly grow. You don't need to constantly look at the horizon all the time. There is a lifetime of a company, and at the beginning of the lifetime, this is excellent and is a must. But when you reach the end, you're wiser and richer and probably make better decisions as a company.
I think we come to a surprisingly similar statement as a conclusion. I believe every company at any point in time is at a stage of the company life cycle. If you found yourself past the maturity stage, just don't stay at exit or decline for too long and try to find a way for renewal and revive. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. My conclusion from it was, I think I've rediscovered the importance of asking yourself very critically, what stage is this company at? And more importantly, perhaps, what stage are different bits of it at? Because most companies are amalgams or conglomerates of different business areas. And I think we've discovered the importance of asking very critically and very seriously and having a deep discussion about what stage they're at and what investment is needed. So I'd like to thank everybody for contributing to this rather different discussion within the Swishoes podcast. And we'll say until we have the next one, say cheerio. Thanks again to Michel Wang, Armin Scharlach, Chris Holmes, Nadia Stoykov, who all join me, Bill Young, today to bring you this podcast on company life cycles.